In the winter of 1943, the skies over Europe were a battlefield of steel and fire. The United States Army Air Forces had committed thousands of men and machines to the daylight bombing campaign against Nazi Germany. Their weapon of choice was the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, a four-engine bomber designed to absorb punishment and deliver destruction deep into enemy territory. By late 1943, the 8th Air Force was flying missions almost daily from bases in England. Their targets were the industrial heartlands of the Reich, factories in Bremen, Hamburg, and the Ruhr Valley. The Luftwaffe responded with ferocity. Squadrons of Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf Fw-190s rose to meet the bombers, while flak batteries lined the coasts and cities. Losses were staggering. Crews knew that every mission could be their last. Among the young men flying these missions was Second Lieutenant Charles "Charlie" Brown, a 21-year-old pilot from West Virginia. Brown commanded a B-17F nicknamed Ye Olde Pub, part of the 379th Bomb Group. On December 20, 1943, Brown and his crew took off from RAF Kimballton for a mission to bomb the Focke-Wulf aircraft factory in Bremen. It was their first combat mission. The crew of Ye Olde Pub included 10 men: pilot Charlie Brown, co-pilot Spencer Luke, navigator Al Sadok, bombardier Vern Albury, engineer/top turret gunner Eckenrode, radio operator Dick Pashute, ball turret gunner Sam Blackie Blackford, waist gunners Hugh Andrews and Lloyd Jennings, and tail gunner Hugh Eckie Eckenrode. They were young, inexperienced, and about to face the full fury of the Luftwaffe. The mission began with heavy flak over Bremen. Explosions rocked the formation. Shrapnel tore through fuselages, and smoke filled the sky. Ye Olde Pub was hit repeatedly. One shell destroyed the nose, wounding Brown and Sadok. Another knocked out one engine. The tail gunner was killed instantly. The bomber fell out of formation, crippled and alone. Brown struggled to keep the plane airborne. The crew fought fires, tended wounds, and manned their guns against waves of German fighters. Bf-109s and Fw-190s swarmed the crippled bomber, riddling it with bullets. The bomber's guns jammed, ammunition ran out, and the crew was helpless. Holes gaped in the fuselage, hydraulic fluid leaked, and oxygen systems failed. The bomber was a flying corpse, yet Brown refused to give up. By the time the Luftwaffe fighters broke off, Ye Olde Pub was barely holding together. Brown set course west, hoping to limp back to England. But over northern Germany, another German fighter approached, a Messerschmitt Bf-109G6 flown by Franz Stigler, a 28-year-old Luftwaffe ace with 27 victories to his name. Stigler had been refueling when he saw the crippled bomber. He scrambled to intercept, expecting an easy kill. But what he saw shocked him. The B-17 was shredded, its crew wounded, its guns silent. Through the holes in the fuselage, he could see men tending to each other, bleeding and exhausted. Stigler realized that firing on the bomber would be murder, not combat. On the morning of December 20, 1943, the airfields of eastern England roared to life. The 8th Air Force was preparing one of its largest missions yet, a strike against the Focke-Wulf aircraft factory in Bremen, a vital hub of German fighter production. The mission called for more than 500 bombers, escorted by P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs. The skies were cold, clear, and filled with tension. For Charlie Brown and his crew aboard the B-17F Ye Olde Pub, this was their first combat mission. They had trained for months, but nothing could prepare them for the reality of flying into the heart of Germany. The crew was young, most in their early 20s, and they carried the weight of history on their shoulders. Their bomber was part of the 379th Bomb Group, stationed at RAF Kimballton. As the formation crossed the North Sea, the men checked their guns, oxygen systems, and bomb racks. The B-17 was nicknamed the Flying Fortress for its defensive firepower. 13.50 caliber machine guns bristled from nose to tail. Yet every crew knew the truth. Fortress or not, a lone bomber was vulnerable. Survival depended on staying in formation. Approaching Bremen, the sky erupted with flak. German anti-aircraft batteries lined the city, firing shells that burst into black clouds of shrapnel. The air shook with explosions. Pilots tightened their grips, navigators called out headings, and gunners scanned the skies for fighters. Ye Olde Pub was hit almost immediately. A shell tore through the nose, shattering plexiglass and wounding Charlie Brown and his navigator Al Sadok. Blood spattered the cockpit. Another shell knocked out the No. 2 engine. The bomber shuddered, struggling to stay in formation. Then the fighters came. Squadrons of Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s swarmed the bombers, diving and firing cannons. The sky became a deadly ballet of tracers and explosions. Ye Olde Pub, already crippled, fell behind. Alone, it became a target. The German fighters attacked relentlessly. The tail gunner, Hugh Eckenrode, was killed instantly when cannon shells ripped through the tail. The ball turret gunner, Sam Blackford, fought desperately, firing bursts at incoming fighters. Waist gunners Andy Andrews and Lloyd Jennings fired until their guns jammed. Ammunition ran low. The bomber was riddled with holes, hydraulic fluid leaking, oxygen systems destroyed. Inside the fuselage, chaos reigned. The crew tended to the wounded, tried to extinguish fires, and prayed the plane would hold together. The radio operator, Dick Peshout, attempted to send distress signals, but the radio was damaged. The bombardier, Vern Albury, abandoned his bomb site to help the wounded. At a 1.0x, Charlie Brown fought to keep the bomber level. His face was bloodied, his oxygen mask torn, but he refused to give up. He pulled the yoke with trembling hands, coaxing the crippled plane westward. The bomber was barely airworthy. One engine was gone, another sputtering, and the fuselage looked like Swiss cheese. The German fighters circled for the kill. One Bf-109 lined up on the bomber's tail, ready to finish it. But then, inexplicably, the fighters broke off. Perhaps they believed the bomber was doomed, or perhaps they were recalled to defend Bremen. Whatever the reason, Ye Olde Pub was left alone, bleeding, burning, but still flying. Brown faced an impossible choice. He could attempt to turn back toward England, a journey of hundreds of miles over hostile territory. Or he could try to land in occupied Europe, risking capture. He chose to head west, determined to bring his crew home. The bomber limped over northern Germany, descending slowly as systems failed. The crew braced for more attacks. And then, on the horizon, another German fighter appeared, a Messerschmitt Bf-109G6, flown by Franz Stigler, a Luftwaffe ace with 27 victories. Stigler had been refueling when he saw the crippled bomber. He scrambled to intercept, expecting an easy kill. As he approached, he prepared to fire. But what he saw through the shattered fuselage stunned him. The B-17 was shredded, its guns hung limp, its crew wounded, its tail destroyed. Through the holes, Stigler could see men tending to each other, bloodied and exhausted. He realized that firing on the bomber would not be combat, it would be murder. Stigler's mind raced. He remembered the words of his commander, Gustav Rodel, who had once told him, "If I ever see you shoot at a man in a parachute, I'll shoot you myself. You fight with honor. If you lose your honor, you lose everything." To Stigler, the crew of Ye Olde Pub were already defeated. Shooting them down would be dishonorable. He made a decision that defied orders, defied logic, and defied the brutal reality of war. He would not kill them. Instead, Stigler pulled alongside the bomber. He gestured to Brown, signaling that he should turn toward neutral Sweden. Brown, dazed and bleeding, misunderstood. He kept heading west. Stigler stayed with him, flying wingtip to wingtip. He escorted the bomber out of German airspace, ensuring that no other fighters attacked. For miles, the German ace and the American crew flew together, enemies bound by a moment of humanity. Finally, as they approached in North Sea, Stigler saluted Brown and peeled away. The bomber continued toward England, battered but alive. Inside Ye Olde Pub, the crew was stunned. They had expected death. Instead, they had been spared by a German pilot who chose mercy over victory. Brown never forgot the moment. He would later say, "He could have destroyed us. He had every right to destroy us. But he didn't. He let us live." At a 1.0, Franz Stigler's Messerschmitt Bf 109 G6 closed in on the crippled B-17. At first glance, it looked like an easy kill. The bomber was riddled with holes, its tail shredded, its guns silent. For a Luftwaffe ace with 27 victories, this was the kind of opportunity that could add another tally to his record. Yet as Stigler approached, he saw something that stopped him cold. Through the torn fuselage, he could see the crew. They were wounded, bleeding, and exhausted. One man was slumped over his gun, unconscious. Another was tending to a comrade with makeshift bandages. The tail gunner's position was destroyed, blood staining the metal. The bomber was barely holding together, limping westward like a wounded animal. Stigler's training told him to finish the job. The Luftwaffe code demanded it. Shooting down bombers was his duty, his mission, his contribution to Germany's war effort. But his conscience rebelled. He remembered the words of his commander, Gustav Rodel, who had once told him, "If I ever see you shoot at a man in a parachute, I'll shoot you myself. You fight with honor. If you lose your honor, you lose everything." To Stigler, the crew of Ye Olde Pub were already defeated. Their guns were silent, their plane crippled. Shooting them down would not be combat, it would be murder. He thought of his own brother, killed earlier in the war, and wondered what he would want for him if he were in that bomber. He thought of the humanity that still existed beneath the uniforms, beneath the flags, beneath the propaganda. Stigler made his choice. He would not kill them. Instead, he pulled alongside the bomber, flying wingtip to wingtip. He gestured to Charlie Brown, signaling that he should turn toward neutral Sweden. Brown, dazed and bleeding, misunderstood. He kept heading west, determined to reach England. Stigler stayed with him, protecting the bomber from other fighters. For miles, the German ace and the American crew flew together, enemies bound by a moment of mercy. Inside the B-17, the crew was stunned. They had expected death. Instead, they saw a German pilot escorting them, refusing to fire. Some thought it was a trick, a cruel game. But as the minutes passed, they realized it was real. Brown later recalled, "He could have destroyed us. He had every right to destroy us. But he didn't. He let us live." Stigler knew the risk he was taking. If the Gestapo discovered what he had done, he could be executed. The Luftwaffe demanded loyalty, obedience, and ruthless efficiency. Sparing an enemy was treason. Yet Stigler believed that honor mattered more than orders. He saluted Brown, then peeled away as the bomber approached the North Sea. Ye Olde Pub continued its desperate journey. The crew fought to keep the plane airborne. Engines sputtered, hydraulics failed, and oxygen systems were gone. They descended lower, gasping for breath, bracing for the long flight over water. Hours later, battered and bleeding, the bomber reached England. Brown managed to land at RAF Seething, barely keeping the plane intact. The crew staggered out, wounded but alive. They owed their survival not only to their own determination, but also to the mercy of a German pilot who chose humanity over victory. The incident became legendary among those who knew it. Brown reported the encounter to his superiors, but the story was classified. The Allies feared that publicizing it might encourage mercy among enemy pilots, undermining the ruthless efficiency of the air war. For decades, the story remained hidden. For Stigler, the decision haunted him. He had spared an enemy, defied orders, and risked his life. Yet he never regretted it. He believed that honor was more important than victory. He continued to fly for the Luftwaffe, surviving the war, but he carried the memory of that day with him. The air war over Europe was brutal. Tens of thousands of airmen were killed, burned alive in their planes, or executed after capture. Mercy was rare. Yet in that moment, above northern Germany, humanity prevailed. A German ace chose compassion, and an American crew lived to tell the tale. The story of Franz Stigler and Charlie Brown illustrates the complexity of war. It shows that even in the midst of destruction, individuals can choose honor over hatred. It reminds us that war is not only about battles and victories, but also about choices, conscience, and humanity. Brown would later say, "We were enemies, but he was a man. He was a man who had a heart, and he saved us." When Charlie Brown and his battered crew finally landed their crippled B-17 Ye Olde Pub at RAF Seething in England, they staggered out of the fuselage in disbelief. Their uniforms were soaked in blood, their faces pale, their bodies trembling from exhaustion. The bomber itself looked like a ghost ship. Holes in the fuselage, shredded tail, engines sputtering, oxygen systems destroyed. Mechanics who inspected the plane later said it was a miracle it had stayed airborne at all. Brown immediately reported the encounter with the German fighter. He explained how a Luftwaffe pilot had flown alongside them, refused to fire, and even saluted before peeling away. His superiors listened carefully, but their reaction was cautious. The story was so extraordinary, so contrary to the brutal reality of the air war, that they feared it might be misunderstood. The U.S. Army Air Forces classified the incident. Brown was told not to speak of it publicly. The Allies worried that if word spread, it might encourage mercy among enemy pilots, undermining the ruthless efficiency of the bombing campaign. The air war was designed to break Germany's industrial backbone, and every bomber lost meant lives saved on the ground. Mercy was not part of the doctrine. For Brown and his crew, the silence was frustrating. They wanted to honor the German pilot who had spared them. They wanted to tell the world about the humanity they had witnessed in the skies over Germany. But they obeyed orders, keeping the story to themselves. Meanwhile, in Germany, Franz Stigler returned to his base with the memory of what he had done. He had spared an enemy, defied orders, and risked his life. Under Nazi law, his actions could have been considered treason. If the Gestapo discovered the truth, he could have been executed. Stigler knew the risks. The Luftwaffe demanded loyalty and obedience. Pilots were expected to destroy enemy bombers without hesitation. Sparing one was unthinkable. Yet Stigler believed that honor mattered more than orders. He had been raised in a culture of chivalry, where knights fought with dignity and respect. To him, the crew of Ye Olde Pub were already defeated. Killing them would have been dishonorable. The incident weighed heavily on him. He continued to fly missions, shooting down other bombers, but he carried the memory of that day with him. He wondered what had happened to the crew. Had they survived? Had they told anyone? He had no way of knowing. The air war raged on. In 1944, the Allies intensified their bombing campaign, targeting oil refineries, rail yards, and factories. The Luftwaffe struggled to keep up. Fuel shortages, pilot losses, and relentless Allied pressure weakened Germany's defenses. By 1945, the skies belonged to the Allies. Stigler survived the war, but his country lay in ruins. Germany was defeated, cities destroyed, millions dead. The Luftwaffe was disbanded, and its pilots scattered. Stigler eventually emigrated to Canada, seeking a new life far from the devastation of Europe. He became a businessman, living quietly, carrying his memories with him. For decades, the story of his mercy remained hidden. Brown and his crew kept silent, bound by military secrecy. Stigler kept silent, bound by fear and the weight of history. It was not until the 1980s that the truth began to emerge. Brown, now retired, began searching for the German pilot who had spared him. He wanted to thank him, to honor him, to finally share the story that had haunted him for decades. Through veterans networks and historical research, he eventually found Franz Stigler in Canada. Their reunion was emotional. Brown embraced Stigler, tears in his eyes, and said, "You saved my life." Stigler replied, "I could not have shot you. You were already defeated." The two men became close friends, bonded by the extraordinary moment they had shared in the skies over Germany. The story, once classified, now became public. Historians and journalists documented the incident, calling it one of the most remarkable acts of mercy in World War II. It was a reminder that even in the darkest times, humanity could prevail. For Stigler, the reunion brought peace. He had carried the memory of that day for decades, wondering what had happened to the crew. Now he knew they had survived, and he was honored for his decision. For Brown, the reunion brought closure. He had lived with the memory of the German pilot who spared him, and now he could finally thank him. The legacy of the incident is profound. It challenges our understanding of war, showing that even in the midst of destruction, individuals can choose compassion. It reminds us that honor and humanity can survive even under the most brutal regimes. It demonstrates that war is not only about battles and victories, but also about choices, conscience, and morality. Historians later emphasized the risks Stigler had taken. Under Nazi Germany, sparing an enemy was treason. Pilots were expected to obey orders without question. The Gestapo monitored loyalty, and disobedience could mean death. By choosing mercy, Stigler had defied the system, risking his life for his conscience. The incident also highlights the complexity of the air war. Tens of thousands of airmen were killed, burned alive in their planes, or executed after capture. Mercy was rare. Yet in that moment, above northern Germany, humanity prevailed. A German ace chose compassion, and an American crew lived to tell the tale. Brown and Stigler's friendship lasted until their deaths. They visited each other's families, attended reunions, and spoke publicly about their story. They wanted the world to know that even in war, humanity could endure. Their story became a symbol of reconciliation. It showed that former enemies could become friends, that compassion could bridge divides, that honor could survive even in the darkest times. It inspired countless people, reminding them that war is not only about destruction, but also about survival, hope, and humanity. The extraordinary encounter between Charlie Brown's crippled B-17 and Franz Stigler's Messerschmitt Bf-109 did not end with the war. In fact, its true impact only began decades later, when the story finally emerged from secrecy and became a symbol of humanity in the midst of destruction. For years after the war, Brown carried the memory of that day in December 1943. He remembered the German pilot who had spared him, the salute through the cockpit glass, and the moment when mercy triumphed over violence. Yet he was bound by military secrecy. The U.S. Army Air Forces had classified the incident, fearing that publicizing it might encourage mercy among enemy pilots. Brown obeyed orders, keeping silent, but the memory never faded. Franz Stigler, meanwhile, lived with his own silence. He had risked his life by sparing the bomber. Under Nazi Germany, mercy was treason. If the Gestapo had discovered what he had done, he could have been executed. After the war, he emigrated to Canada, seeking a new life far from the ruins of Europe. He became a businessman, living quietly, carrying his memories with him. He wondered what had happened to the crew of Ye Olde Pub. Had they survived? Had they remembered him? He had no way of knowing. The air war itself became one of the most studied aspects of World War II. Historians documented the staggering losses. More than 26,000 American airmen killed in Europe, thousands more captured or wounded. The daylight bombing campaign was brutal, relentless, and costly. Mercy was rare. Yet in that moment above northern Germany, humanity had prevailed. By the 1980s, Brown, now retired, began searching for the German pilot who had spared him. He wanted to thank him, to honor him, to finally share the story that had haunted him for decades. Through veterans networks and historical research, he eventually found Franz Stigler in Canada. Their reunion was emotional. Brown embraced Stigler, tears in his eyes, and said, "You saved my life." Stigler replied, "I could not have shot you. You were already defeated." The two men became close friends, bonded by the extraordinary moment they had shared in the skies over Germany. They visited each other's families, attended reunions, and spoke publicly about their story. They wanted the world to know that even in war, humanity could endure. Their friendship lasted until their deaths. Brown died in 2008, Stigler in the same year. Both men were honored for their courage and humanity. Their story was documented in books, articles, and documentaries, becoming one of the most remarkable incidents of World War II. The legacy of the incident is profound. It challenges our understanding of war, showing that even in the midst of destruction, individuals can choose compassion. It reminds us that honor and humanity can survive even under the most brutal regimes. It demonstrates that war is not only about battles and victories, but also about choices, conscience, and morality. Historians emphasize the risks Stigler had taken. Under Nazi Germany, sparing an enemy was treason. Pilots were expected to obey orders without question. The Gestapo monitored loyalty, and disobedience could mean death. By choosing mercy, Stigler had defied the system, risking his life for his conscience. The incident also highlights the complexity of the air war. Tens of thousands of airmen were killed, burned alive in their planes, or executed after capture. Mercy was rare. Yet in that moment, above northern Germany, humanity prevailed. A German ace chose compassion, and an American crew lived to tell the tale. Brown and Stigler's friendship became a symbol of reconciliation. It showed that former enemies could become friends, that compassion could bridge divides, that honor could survive even in the darkest times. It inspired countless people, reminding them that war is not only about destruction, but also about survival, hope, and humanity. Their story has been taught in schools, shared in military academies, and celebrated in documentaries. It has become a case study in ethics, a reminder that even in war, individuals can choose humanity. It has inspired soldiers, civilians, and leaders alike, reminding them that honor and compassion are universal values. The moral lessons of the incident are timeless. It shows that war does not erase humanity. It demonstrates that individuals can choose compassion even when surrounded by violence. It reminds us that honor matters more than victory, that conscience matters more than obedience, that humanity matters more than ideology. For Brown, the incident was a reminder that survival is not only about strength, but also about mercy. For Stigler, it was a reminder that honor is not only about victories, but also about choices. For the world, it is a reminder that even in the darkest times, humanity can endure. The story continues to inspire new generations. It is retold in books, films, and lectures. It is celebrated as one of the most remarkable incidents of World War II. It is a reminder that history is not only about battles and victories, but also about choices, conscience, and humanity. In the end, the legacy of the Charlie Brown-Franz Stigler incident is not only historical, but also moral. It demonstrates that ordinary people can make extraordinary choices. It shows that courage is not limited to soldiers on battlefields, but extends to individuals who choose compassion. It reminds us that resistance is possible, even under the most brutal regimes. The pilot's survival is a symbol of this legacy. His story illustrates the power of compassion, the importance of courage, and the decisive role of conscience. It is a reminder that victory in war depends not only on weapons and armies, but also on the determination of individuals to choose humanity. It is a story that continues to resonate, decades after the guns fell silent.